So we're going to ask two closely related questions. First, what are some issues with conducting pre-election polls? And second, how can we minimize those errors? What we're going to identify are questions that you should ask of any poll. Unfortunately, they're not often given to you, so you often have to go looking for the answers themselves. It seems just crazy to me that we spend so much time talking about poll results without discussing the process and method by which they come by. At the end of the day, after all, the results are only as good as the method. So unless you know how the poll is being done, you can't really understand what the results mean. But it seems that audiences have decided that they don't really want to know about the particulars of polling, so here we are. Okay, rant over. We're going to start with a brief overview of survey methodology. This will give you the general idea of what pollsters are trying to do and how they do it. Then we're going to talk about three types of errors that pollsters can make: administration-based errors, respondent and context-based errors, and question-based errors. We're going to illustrate each type of error with some specific examples to help familiarize and ground the concept. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to break this down into two lectures. The first one, which you're now watching, will present an overview of survey research and talk about the first type of error, errors that are performed in the administration of the surveys, administration-based errors. Some of this will hopefully be familiar from our history of pre-election polling lecture. The second lecture is going to focus on responding context-based errors and question-based errors, as well as giving a wrap-up. So at the end of these two lectures, hopefully you'll be able to name the various types of polling errors, provide some examples of each, and also be able to identify them when given an example. You should also be able to talk about survey research and polling and what the general ideas and concepts are that are involved. Again, the goal is not to make you a pollster. Instead, the job is to empower you to be able to critically assess the numbers we know the media is going to talk about, both in this current election and elections to come. So again, equipping you with the tools that you need to know to be a critical consumer of the information to make sense of what's going on, I think is critically important to be an informed citizen in our country and our democracy. And the goal of these lectures is to give you the tools and the concepts to be able to think critically and understand under what conditions you should trust and not trust the numbers that you may hear. So let's get started. So public opinion surveys are widely used. Political consultants obviously use it. We learned how market researchers such as George Gallup used it, and they also widely use it to do product development, ad testing, assess customer satisfaction, and so on. Academics such as myself use it, and so do governments. So the basic question we face is this, which anyone faces. How can you collect information about individuals that you may not be able to observe just from their behavior alone? So we know that we're now all being tracked to see which stores we visit, how long we spend in each, and how frequently. But this data that you can collect based on from our cell phones can't really tell us what we think of the products within or the experiences we have. Netflix, for example, knows what shows I've been watched recently, but it can't know what shows I want to watch next. It can guess, often badly from what I can tell, based on past viewership, but past behavior doesn't always predict the future. So survey research is the method of using questionnaires, surveys, to gather information from individuals. But it's not just talking to people, right? It's not just a conversation. Instead, survey research is about systematizing the collection of information, using the same procedures and the same questions to make sure that we treat every respondent equally and that we can therefore directly compare their answers at the end. So the benefit of this approach is that in principle, it allows us the ability to measure the opinions and thoughts, things that we can't even directly observe. Now, while some of the stuff can be observed, for example, education level or your age, other aspects can't. So what party do you feel closer to? How likely are you to vote in the upcoming election, and for who? Right? You can't know this from our behavior alone. So critical to the idea of survey research is the survey itself. So we call this the survey instrument, and it's the tool that we survey research and pollsters rely upon. All that the survey instrument is the set of questions that respondents are going to be asked, the set of responses they're going to be asked to choose between, and the order in which we're going to ask those questions. So we're going to talk about the ways in which each of these can affect the results of a poll later on, but for now the important thing is to know that the information we collect in survey research is collected based on the survey instrument that the pollster writes. And that survey instrument contains of the questions, the responses, and the order of those questions that are being asked. So once you write the survey instrument, the next step is to figure out how you want people to take that survey that you just wrote. So there's two basic ways to do a survey. The first is self-administered. So surveys that you get in the mail or that you do over the internet are examples of self-administered surveys. So this is increasingly how surveys are being done nowadays, given the rise of internet polling and polling via text messages. So there's pros and cons. So pros is that because it's being self-administered, more items can be asked. People can read a survey really quickly and take the answers. And as a result, it's also pretty low cost. The only thing that it costs you is sending an email, right? Or sending a postage stamp. which is getting increasingly expensive, but that's your only cost that you have once you write the survey. Now the con is that it's a low response rate. So think of how easy it is for you to ignore an email or throw out something that you get in the mail that you're not sure who it's from. So on the one hand, we can ask more questions cheaply, but on the con is that often these self-administered surveys have very low response rates. So typically less than a handful of every 100 people that we ask bother to send in our survey responses. So the second way we can do surveys is through human interviews. Either an actual human comes to your house to talk to you, approaches you at a polling place, or calls you on your cell phone or landline. So rather than entering the responses to the survey instrument yourself, you're telling someone else what you think, who then records your answers. So again, there's also pros and cons here. So the pro is that because you're talking to a human being, they can clarify the responses if there's something that you're uncertain about. And moreover, once you start a poll with someone, you're more likely to finish them. It's just the nature of human behavior that if you're talking to someone, it's very hard to hang up with them. So the con, though, is that it's higher cost. And this leaves a smaller sample. You have to pay someone to actually conduct those interviews. So that's going to cost more money, and as a result, you have smaller sample sizes. Another potential issue is precisely because you're talking to another human being, that this can affect the responses that you give. You may be less likely to say some responses than others because you're worried about what that interviewer may think about you. So again, there's two different ways that we can administer a survey instrument. One is self-administered, which is that you, the survey respondent, takes it yourself, or the second is a human interviewer, which says someone else gives the survey to you and you tell them what your responses are. So how does this whole survey research thing work conceptually? So the population is a set of everyone of interest. So that's the mass of people on the left-hand side. So these are the opinions, beliefs, or behaviors of the people you're trying to measure. It could be every adult in the United States, or maybe just every adult who's eligible to vote, or every adult who's eligible to vote and who is also currently registered to vote, or just every adult who is likely to vote in the election. While similar, these are four different populations. The set of adults in the United States is very different from the set of likely voters in the United States, and the differences between those groups are important. Think about it. How does the adult population differ from the set of likely voters? And if you learned about one of those, can you infer anything about the others? So the former, for example, the set of all adults in the United States includes immigrants, people unable to vote because of the criminal justice system, people with intellectual disabilities, and so forth. That's a very different set of opinions you're likely to get than if you just talk to eligible and likely voters. So the first step of any poll is to identify what population precisely you're trying to estimate. So in pre-election polls, we often see pollsters focusing on one of either two populations, the set of all currently registered voters or the set of likely voters. So again, these groups are similar, but they may differ and those differences can matter. In fact, if we look at the turnout in an election, that helps us compare the different sizes of these two groups and how that might differ. So in the 2016 presidential election, for example, turnout was at a 20-year low. Only 61.4% of citizens voted. This was more than 2 percentage points lower than the 63.6% turnout we saw in 2008. So, assuming we can correctly estimate who is likely to vote, and more on that later, the decision to focus on registered voters versus likely voters is a decision as to whether to try to capture the people who are maybe unlikely to vote. So if you're trying to predict a presidential election, probably not. You probably only want to focus on those 61.4% of the people who actually cast a ballot. But if we're trying to measure presidential approval, on the other hand, maybe we also care about the opinions of non-voters, or people who are unlikely to vote. After all, our government is supposed to represent the views of all citizens, regardless of party, and regardless of whether or not they're willing or even able to vote. So once a pollster decides upon the population they're trying to measure, they now need to figure out how to measure that population. If we survey every member of the population, this is called a census. Analyzing the results of a census is easy because we've talked to everybody. All we need to do is add up the results. But they're really hard and very expensive to pull off. So there's a reason why we only do the census in the United States once every 10 years. And even when we do, there's seemingly lots of obscure debates about sampling adjustments to try to account for undercounts, otherwise known as non-response, as we'll talk about later. So if we can't talk to every likely voter, the next best thing is to talk to a subset of them. So the set of people we actually talk to in a survey is called the sample. So how we select the sample and how well that sample reflects the population is absolutely critical. And again, something we're going to dive into later. But for now, understand that the second step of conducting a poll, after you identify the population, which is the first step, the second step is to select the subset of individuals from that population. And we call that the sample, because those are people that we're going to talk to. So then we survey the sample. So given the survey instrument, you ask them their questions and we analyze the results. The results of the survey, in technical terms, is known as our sample statistic. To make this concrete, for example, the percentage of likely voters who say that they support Biden over Trump when we ask them, is a sample statistic. So what do we do with that? So at this point, pollsters have to make a bit of a leap. So we don't really care about the views of the 1,000 people we actually talk to. Instead, we care about the views of the entire electorate. So what we need to do is to make a claim as to why the views of the 1,000 people we talk to can be used to make a valid inference or estimate about what the entire population thinks. So people who talk about polls do this reflexively, but this step is absolutely critical. Technically, the results of a poll only measure the views of the people we talk to. To interpret the results as reflecting the views of the entire population, right, the set of all likely voters, and therefore a prediction of what's going to happen on election day, requires an argument as to why it's valid to make an inference about the population based on these 1,000 responses or however many people you actually talk to. So if the sample is randomly selected and every respondent is equally likely to respond to our survey, then it's pretty straightforward to make an argument as to why the results generalize. But if not, then things become much more complicated, and we run into situations where the results of the poll may not reflect the population of interest. Unfortunately, this is often the world we live in, and we're going to talk about the consequences and the complexities that this involves in a little bit. To change things up a little bit, let's hear about this in a little bit more detail from Courtney Kennedy. Courtney Kennedy is the Director of Survey Research at the Pew Research Center, who's a nonprofit devoted to public opinion and the study of public opinion. So Courtney was the chair of the 2016 task force put together by the American Association of Public Opinion Research that was charged with looking into what happened in the 2016 pre-election poll. I also know Courtney from NBC News, where she's a critical part of looking at exit polls and help analyzing what goes on election night. So let's hear what she has to say about how a sample can be used to reflect the views of a population.
Survey of a small group of people measure public opinion of the entire United States. This idea is called random sampling, where instead of talking to everyone in the population, you talk to a group of people who represent the entire population. Of course, if you want to measure what the entire nation thinks, you can't just stand on a street corner and wave people over. That type of haphazard sample would only represent the people near that street corner at that particular time, and you wouldn't get the people that didn't necessarily want to talk with you. A nationally representative survey requires a random sample in which each person in the United States had a chance of selection. Survey researchers have spent decades perfecting methods to draw a truly random sample that includes all ages, all incomes, all ethnic and racial backgrounds, and all political persuasions. We actually use random sampling all the time in everyday life. For example, when you're making soup, if you stir the pot correctly, you don't have to drink the entire pot of soup to know if it needs more salt. Instead, you can just have a spoonful, because each spoonful tastes like the pot of soup overall. That's random sampling. So once you have your random sample, how can you ensure that it actually represents the overall population? A sample could differ from the overall population because some people are more likely than others to take surveys. So pollsters use a standard technique called weighting to adjust for differences. We know the demographic composition of the United States thanks to data from the US Census Bureau. So once we have our sample, we compare the respondents' demographics to the makeup of the whole country. We look at things like age, gender, education, race, and region. Weighting allows us to adjust our survey data so that it matches the general population on these characteristics. So because of random sampling and weighting, we can take something small like a survey sample and use it to describe something much larger, like the attitudes of all US adults.
So that's an overview of survey research. What it is, how it's done, what's the general idea. So to really understand a poll though, you have to think about all the ways that a poll could be wrong. And in general, there are 3 types of polling errors that can occur. The first is an administration-based error. This is an error that is introduced in the poll based on how the poll is being done. So 2 prominent examples that we're going to talk about are sampling bias, which we've already seen an example of in 1936, and then also interviewer effects, which we kind of saw in 1948 as well. The second type of error is because of errors that are introduced either by the respondent or by society. So these are due to non-response, an error that recurs because not everyone will take our survey, or social desirability, how people are going to respond to the questions being asked, or the context in which the survey occurs in terms of when and where. And the final set of errors that we're going to talk about are instrument-based. These are problems with a survey that the survey pollster used to collect the data. So these can be errors in both the question, like how the question's asked, and also the orders that the question is being asked upon. So again, in the rest of the lecture, we're just going to talk about the first type of error, administration-based. But in later lectures, we're going to dive into the other 2 types of errors and talk about the total implications of how that could affect survey research. So let's start. The problem with sampling bias is the people that we're talking to may not reflect the overall population that we're interested in. So the 1,000 or so people that we're talking to in our survey are systematically different from those that we're interested in making inferences about in terms of what the overall electorate looks like. So to help make this even clearer, let's talk about some examples that show how powerful the problem of survey sampling bias is and why it's still present with us today and also historically. So whenever we talk about sampling bias in pre-election polls, we start with the Literary Digest poll of 1936. Again, we already talked about it, but it's important to reiterate because of how important it was. So in the Literary Digest poll, they surveyed their readership, as well as anyone who owned a telephone or belonged to a club and association in the middle of the Great Depression. So as a result of doing this, they got 2.4 million respondents to send their postcard back, right? It's a self-administered survey. And their prediction was the graph that shows up of the United States on the left. Republican Alf Landon in the red was going to win a majority of the states and win the presidency in a landslide. The reality, however, was quite different. The reality is reflected by the graph on the right. So you can see FDR basically swept the entire election. So here we had a large sample, but the sample is very biased. The way that we selected the 2.4 million people to survey was not going to reflect the overall electorate. So by relying on subscriber and mailing lists, the survey oversampled middle and upper class voters. Now also, as we saw, this is a problem that still exists today. So often whenever we see an opt-in survey, especially ones that are hosted on websites, there's very little credibility involved with these. So for example, here's a survey that's done by Breitbart, which reveals that 97.83% stand with President Trump. This was taken at the time of the impeachment. Now, this may be a very good survey of who visits Breitbart.com, but it's completely unrepresentative of the overall electorate. So how you make an inference about what this means about the overall state of public opinion in the country is entirely unclear. Here's another example that shows up a lot in the websites when you're surfing these days. An invitation to take a survey, an official media survey about whether you think the media reports fairly on President Trump. So just ask yourself, who's going to opt in to take this survey? Now, I'm not saying that any media actually uses this survey and reports upon it, but here's an example of a survey in which you have no belief that the people who are taking this are going to be representative of anything other than very hardcore President Trump supporters. So again, it may reflect what hardcore President Trump supporters think, but typically that's not who we're interested in. We're interested in the overall electorate when doing pre-election polls. Now, another example that cuts close to home for a lot of pollsters, so those who are relying on human interviews have to have a choice about how are you going to have those interviews contact potential respondents. And the question whether or not use a cell phone or a landline or both is hugely consequential. So this is from the National Health Interview Survey conducted by the US government that shows the percentage of adults in the United States that only have cell phones. And here we can see that as of 2017, that was more than half of the country, 53.3%. So if you're a pollster who's only talking about landlines, you're going to miss more than half of the country. So that's going to be really consequential, especially if those with cell phones differ from those with landlines, which, not surprisingly, they do. So here's an example again from Pew Research Center, who did a study looking at how people who respond to landline surveys differ from people who are reached on their cell phone. And you can see that those differences are ginormous. So for example, look at the demographic between 18 and 29-year-olds. Only 7% of the people who answered on a landline survey were between the ages of 18 and 29. But on a cell phone, 42% of respondents were in that age group. Conversely, look at the older people. If you're above the age of 65, you're taking surveys on a landline. Nearly 50% of the people who took the survey on a landline were above the age of 65. In contrast, if you try to reach someone on the cell phone, only 5% of the people that you reach on a cell phone are going to be above the age of 65. There's also a difference in education level. Those with a high school education or less are more likely to have a landline than a cell phone. Those who are college educated are more likely to be college educated than a landline. And women are also more likely to be answering the phone on the landline than a cell phone. Differently, the method that you use to conduct your survey can introduce sampling bias if the method that you're using is only available to some of the population. So cell phone users don't reflect necessarily the views of those who have landlines. If I do a survey on the internet, I'm not necessarily going to be able to capture the views of those who don't have the internet. And so thinking hard about how the survey is being done can have real implications for the ability to interpret that survey to reflect more than just the people that are contacted. And in fact, to be able to represent the views of the people that you're not able to contact because they don't have the technology that you have. Toolbox that can be used to correct for sampling bias is survey weighting. In theory, weights allow pollsters to make the results better reflect the population of interest by upweighting and downweighting respondents as needed. However, this is not always an easy task. In pre-election polls, we often do not know what the electorate will look like before Election Day. While we know what the demographics of the state of Tennessee look like because of the census, we don't know how those who will vote in Tennessee will compare to the demographics of the state overall. As a result, pollsters are forced to make their best estimate of what they think the electorate's going to look like and weight the results to that guess. Of course, if they are wrong, which is to say the electorate is different than they supposed, then they are weighting their polls to the wrong numbers, and they will be likely wrong as a result. So the importance of weighting depends on how the poll is being done. One type of poll that is commonly used to do state-level polls nowadays, because of how inexpensive they are, uses interactive voice recording technology, so-called robopolls. These are polls that are completely administered by a computer. A computer auto-dials a set of phone numbers, perhaps from a voter file, perhaps that are randomly generated, and then the computer asks a series of questions to whomever answers. The person answering is asked to press a number on the keypad that indicates their response. While cheap, an important limitation is that IVR robopolls are only legally allowed to call landline numbers. Given how different the set of people who have landlines is from those that have cell phones that we just talked about, this creates a real problem for pollsters. How can they adjust the results of a landline-based sample to reflect the views of people who have cell phones? In many ways, this is a version of the same problem that the Literary Digest faced. What IVR pollsters try to do is to weight the results to make them better reflect the composition of what they think the electorate looks like. So if only 7% of landline users are between the ages of 18 and 29, this means that IVR robopolls need to upweight those respondents a lot, and also hope that the 18 to 29-year-olds with landlines are similar to those that do not have landlines. Sometimes they can use the results of other polls to help them do this. When pollsters release the results of the poll, they often know the results of other polls. As a result, there's a tempting possibility to use the results of these other polls to help weight your own poll. This ensures that your poll will be not much different relative to the existing polls that are already released. This is known as the phenomenon of herding, using the results of other polls to help determine how you should weight your own poll. While using the results from other polls may help ensure that a pollster does not release a poll that is too different from others, it also creates the potential for self-fulfilling poll results. Does the fact that all of the polls are saying the same thing, for example, mean that public opinion is very clear on the issue? Or does it mean that the pollsters are all weighting their polls using the results of previous polls, which causes the poll results to look similar? These are very different interpretations, but also critically important to make that distinction. So the importance of herding varies depending on how much the pollster needs to rely on weighting. For what we typically think of as a gold standard poll, that is a poll done with human interviewers of both landlines and cell phones, then we may be fairly confident in the results after only some minor weighting. But if we are using an IVR robopoll and we know that we're only talking to people with landlines, then the weights become far more critical because we know from the outset that we're only able to reach a non-random subset of the electorate. To see how much of a problem the issue of herding may be for these IVR polls that we frequently use to do state-level polling, I wrote and published a paper looking at how the accuracy of these IVR robopolls differs depending on whether or not the poll was being done in a state where a gold standard human interview poll was also being done. This graph summarizes the main results. Each letter is a poll. H indicates a human interview poll, R indicates an IVR robopoll in a state where a human interview poll was also done, and RO indicates that an IVR robopoll is being done in a state without a human interviewer poll. The x-axis indicates how many days the poll was done to election day. So these are polls that were done and released the day before elections. These are polls that were done 28 days prior to the election. The y-axis reports the absolute value of the polling error, measured using the difference between the poll result and the certified election result. While there are lots of interesting patterns, note, for example, there are many more IVR robopolls, i.e. polls that are either R or ROs than H's, than human polls. And also note that as we get closer to election day, the amount of error goes down. So polls are more accurate as we get closer to election day. But in states with a human gold standard poll, there's no real difference between IVR robopolls and human polls in terms of accuracy. That is the solid line that indicates the results of what a poll done with human interviews reveals. That's very similar to this poll done by IVR polls in states with a human gold standard poll. So prior to election day, IVR polls in places with a human gold standard poll were about 4 points off. But compare that to what we see with IVR robopolls in states without a human gold standard poll. So this is signified by this dashed line. So in this case, the average amount of error is about 8 points, nearly twice as much as the IVR poll with a human interviewer poll. So what this means is that the inability to know what other polls find seems to have a pretty dramatic effect on the accuracy of IVR polls, suggesting not only that weighting decisions are really important for these IVR robopolls, but also that IVR polls seem to be weighted to match the results of pre-existing polls done by human polls. If so, this means that we should not necessarily read too much into the results of a newly reported IVR poll. If it's similar to what existing polls show, it's possible, doesn't prove, but it's possible that the similarity we observe is a result of the weighting being done by the pollster, rather than what the survey itself is actually revealing about the electorate. But you don't have to take my word for it. Shortly after my article was published, 538.com did their own analysis of the same phenomena, and they found the same thing. So here's the results of their analysis, where they looked at all Senate campaign pre-election polling done since 2006, and they found precisely the same relationship that we found. So non-traditional polls, so these are IVR robopolls without a gold standard human poll, their error was much greater than non-traditional polls where a human poll was available. Once again, showing that IVR pollsters seem to be using the existence of other polls to help weight the results. So what this means for you when you read polls is that if you see an IVR, i.e. robopoll, being done in a state without a human level poll, you might be worried about how accurate that poll is. And even if you see one, you may be concerned that what the IVR poll is doing is just weighting to the nearest human poll that was done. In either case, how to interpret them becomes somewhat problematic. So here's the issue, right? So I said that IVR polls can't call cell phones. So recently, this was taken before the Supreme Court and ruled that it was still constitutional. So as you can see here, this is from the FCC talking about the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. And so what it says is that you cannot have any auto dialing without pre-existing consent, which means that the way pollsters do their polling, they typically call a bunch of numbers without getting consent and trying to ask them a bunch of questions. But as you can see here, political campaign-related auto-dialed or pre-recorded voice calls are not allowed. In fact, there's a $500 penalty per call, which means that if you're a pollster and you use IVR polling, there's no way that you'd risk calling a cell phone, because every attempt you make could cost you $500, which just highlights the possibility that when we look at these IVR pollsters that you see in 538 or Real Clear Politics, you need to take a real careful look to see what they're actually weighting to and whether or not you think that those results are credible in the absence of human polling being done in the same state. Let's wrap this little section up. So we talked about that the important part of polling is how we go from population, so the set of what we think the electorate's going to look like on election day, to select only a subset of those people to talk to with our survey. So that process of drawing that sample offers the possibility of problems. And so one administrative problem that we can see when we administer surveys is a problem of sample bias. That means the 1,000 or so people that we're talking to with our survey differ systematically than the set of overall voters who are going to vote on election day. So we saw lots of different examples of this. We saw Literary Digest have the administrative problem because of how they administered their survey and the fact they were only talking to people on magazine lists and who had a telephone, not the people who were necessarily going to vote in 1936. We saw how this is a problem for contemporary phones done by human interviewers, depending on whether or not you're using a landline or a cell phone. The set of voters who have a landline look very different than the set of voters who have a cell phone, and if we only use one of those, that's going to create real problems. And we saw the realization of this complexity when we looked at the problems that IVR robopolls do when trying to do their polling. Because they are legally restricted to only call landlines, they were forced to rely on weighting to try to make inferences about what the overall electorate looks like. And we saw the possible difficulties that they have in trying to do so, especially in the absence of human gold standard polls being done. So again, one problem that pollsters face is errors introduced by how the surveys are being administered, and one prominent example of that is sampling bias, which is that people who are being talked to by the survey are systematically different than the overall population of voters who we think is going to vote on election. So now let's consider a second error that can happen when surveys are being administered. So a second type of administration error is an error due to the interviewer. So again, we call that an administration error is an error that occurs as a result of how the survey is being given. So an interviewer effect is any effect on the data gathered from interviewing people that's caused by the behavior or characteristics of the interviewer. So put differently, individuals might answer questions that they're given from the survey instrument differently depending on whether they're taking a live interview, a recorded interview, or an online interview. Again, this is the difference between being a human interview versus a self-administration interview. And so these are all differences that if people are more likely to say a different answer to a human than they are if they're filling out the survey in their own home, then that's a possible source of error and a possible source of difference that's due to interviewer effect. Or if you're talking to a human, maybe you'll get different answers depending on whether you're talking to a male or a female interviewer, or a white or a black interviewer. All these are different reasons to think about. If there's a reason that you might give different answers, then that's a possible source of interviewer effects. The thing we worry about as pollsters is that how we collect the data, and in particular how we interview people and who's interviewing the person, may affect the answers that they give. And the primary example, the primary concern that we have is what's known as social desirability bias, which is that when survey respondents are giving answers to questions, they give the answers that they think the interviewer wants to hear rather than expressing their true belief. So put differently, when they're talking to someone and they ask them a question, they don't say what they're really going to do or they're likely to do, but instead they give the answer they think the respondent wants to hear. So a prominent example of this is that when we ask people, are they going to vote? Inevitably, the people say, yes, I'm not going to be a bad citizen. Of course I'm going to vote. Even though we know that turnout is only about 60% in presidential elections. So it's the socially desirable answer is to tell the interviewer you're talking to that of course you're going to vote. Because yes, you're a good citizen. Yes, you're a good American. Yeah, you're going to go to the polling place, even if it's unlikely that you actually do so. So these interview effects can actually be pretty large and pretty consequential. So here's one example. So this is from way back when in 1998, but it shows the example of how the race of an interview can have really large consequences. So this was a question that was asked that was asking about whether or not there should be a national apology for slavery. So again, these are about 1,000 people interviewed in May 1998. So again, lots of years from now, but still illustrates the general point about the effect that different interviewers can have on the answers that people are willing to give. So those respondents who were talked to on a cell phone or landline, they were interviewed by a black interviewer, you can say these are what they said. So 41% approve of a national apology and 51% oppose, a 10-point difference. However, if they talked to a non-black interviewer, you can see the responses you got were very, very different. Now there's a 26-point difference between those who said they favor a national apology and those who oppose. And in particular, you can quite clearly see that people are much more likely to say that they oppose a national apology when talking to a non-black interviewer on this question than if they're talking to a black interviewer. So again, here's a clear example of how who you're talking to can affect the answers that the respondents are giving. And so of course, when you're taking the survey, you don't actually know the interviewer. So these are all people making suppositions based on the conversation that they're having about who they think their interviewer is and then adjusting their answers accordingly. So here's another example. So another question that pollsters ask is, trying to think about like what people think about are the limitations for people getting ahead. So one question that's been asked is what thinking about are reasons why, there's this extreme disparity among racial groups in terms of their economic performance and their ability to get ahead in the United States. And so two responses that they were giving is the primary reason because of racial discrimination, or is it a story about personal responsibility? So again here, depending upon who the interviewer was, we're going to see very different answers. So respondents who are talking to a black interviewer, you see there's a 16-point difference. 35% say racial discrimination, 51% have some notion about personal responsibility. But when we talk about a non-black interviewer, that difference, it nearly doubles. So it goes from a 16-point difference in those responses to a whopping 35-point difference. So now the percentage you say that's racial discrimination is responsible falls from 35% when they're talking to a black interviewer to 26% with a non-black interviewer. So again, depending upon how that survey is being administered, and in particular, who's the human being that's interviewing the respondent, we can see that you get very, very different answers, which makes the question of what is the truth. So that one thing we worry about then is how we administer the survey, and in particular, who the interviewer is, can affect how people choose to respond to the survey and what responses they give. They may give socially desirable responses, which is responses that they think that the interviewer wants them to say. And so these are two examples where we saw quite clearly among racial issues that there seem to be pretty powerful effects depending upon the race of the interviewer and how that affects the people who are being questioned on their survey. The question of interviewer effects has also been raised in response to more contemporary pre-election polling. In particular, the whole concern about shy Trump voters, that is, voters who are afraid or reluctant to tell that they really support President Trump to a human being, has been pointed as one possible explanation for why the 2016 pre-election polls missed badly. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth when we look at 2016 in particular. But for now, the general supposition is that perhaps that the shy Trump voters is another example of a phenomenon of interviewer effect. That is, people are afraid to tell another human being that they actually support President Trump. Now, on the one hand, this seems a little bit crazy because you see lots of people willing to go to rallies and wear hats and have flags. But nonetheless, there's a supposition that maybe among some of the voters, Republican-leaning voters, suburban housewives and so forth, maybe they're more reluctant than others to report they support President Trump because they think that's a socially undesirable response. So the possibility that having to talk to a human interviewer could cause some supporters of President Trump to not report that they're supporting President Trump, the so-called shy Trump voter, is also a claim that's being made about the 2020 election. So here's a story about the Christian Science Monitor asking whether or not the 2020 election polls that are being done right now are also affected by the shy Trump voter. So let's take a step back in time, go back to 2016, and listen to an interview by Kellyanne Conway, the advisor to the President Trump, talking about the polls prior to the election and what she has to say about shy Trump voters and their existence.
Voting numbers for Donald Trump are looking pretty bad, aren't they, at the moment?
No, just the cherry-picked polling numbers that are put out there by media outlets that are also bent on his destruction. Donald Trump performs consistently better in online polling, where a human being is not talking to another human being about what he or she may do in the election.
Why is that, do you think?
It's because it's become socially desirable, especially if you're a college-educated person in the United States of America, to say that you're against Donald Trump. The hidden Trump vote in this country is a very significant proposition.
Have you been able to put a number on that?
Yes.
Group. What do you think that is?
I can't discuss it.
Oh, come on.
No, it's a project we're doing internally. I call it the undercover Trump voter, but it's real.
So as part of the 2016 American Association of Public Opinion Research Task Force on Pre-Election Polling, we did a lot of work to actually look to see if there was a shy Trump voter effect. And so what did we find? Well, let's see. So the basic claim of the shy Trump voter effect is the fact that supporters of President Trump will be less likely to tell human interviewers that they support President Trump than they would be if they're just answering the survey by themselves. So this is exactly the words that Kellyanne Conway used when describing the polling results that they were finding in their secret investigation. So here's what we found in our investigation. So here graphs the support for Secretary Clinton at the time throughout the 2016 election, starting in late August and going up all the way up to Election Day. So you can see we break it down by three different types of polls. Internet polls, so these are self-administered where there's no human involved. IVR online polls, so again, these are no human involved. Either you're talking to a computer, the IVR polls, or you're taking the poll on a computer in an online poll, or a live phone, which has a human interviewer. And so if the shy Trump voter phenomenon is real, and it's caused by the fact that people are reluctant to tell human interviewers that they support President Trump when they would be willing to do so if they're taking the survey by themselves, we should find big differences. And in particular, we should find Secretary Clinton doing the best among polls that are done by live phone interviewers where respondents are forced to talk to human beings. But if you look at those three lines, you can see there's not a whole heck of a lot of difference. In fact, President Trump's support is not indistinguishable among any of those three lines. So it doesn't matter whether the survey was done by the internet, with a real human, or with an IVR robo-poll and also an online. There's just no evidence that the responses that people were given were systematically different depending on whether or not they were talking to a human interviewer or not. In other words, no real evidence of a shy Trump voter. But we can look at this another way. The other thing, so here's some results that Harry Enten did at 538 that looks at whether or not the shy Trump voter caused bigger misses in places where voters may be more reluctant to talk to a human interviewer or even a pollster in general. So to break this down, the x-axis tells you how much Trump is leading in the polls. So if you look at that vertical line, dots in the right-hand side of that graph are states in which Trump was leading in the polls. Dots to the left of that line are places where Trump was losing in the polls. And then the y-axis says how well the vote margin compares to the polling average, which is, does Trump do better than the polls or does he underperform the polls? So if we look at those four quadrants then, in the upper right-hand corner, these are the set of polls where Trump was both leading in the polls and when on election day, his election returns were actually better than the polls predicted. And so you can see that there's a large number of polls where this was the case. So a lot of the places where Trump was polled as being leading in the polls, he did even better than is expected. The polls in the lower left, so these indicate places where not only was Trump losing in the polls, but on election day, he did worse than expected. So again, although Trump was losing, he actually did worse than predicted by the polls. So he underperformed. So the set of polls, though, in the upper left-hand corner, this is what caused polling people a lot of consternation. So these are examples where Trump was losing in the polls, but outperformed on election day. And so we did a whole task force trying to figure out what was going on here, and we'll talk about that separately. But the general point is that if you look at that cluster of points, what you can see is that where Trump is outperforming the polls, i.e. the set of points that are above the 0-degree line in the y-axis, those are largely contained in states where Trump was predicted to do very well in the polls. So if we think about the whole phenomenon of shy Trump voter, we might think that that's going to be caused by Republican supporters living in states where President Trump is not popular. But that's not what we find. We see that the largest places where Trump was understated was in states that voted overwhelmingly for President Trump. So again, there's certainly certain states where President Trump did better than the polls, and those were enough to basically flip how we predict the state. So I don't want to undersell those. But by and large, if we look at all the polls in all the states, what we see is the largest amount of underperformance of the polls, right, where the polls underpredicted President Trump's support. It was not in blue states or not in swing states. It was in states that were solid Trump states, which seems weird if we think about shy Trump voters, because why would a Trump voter be shy in a state where President Trump won overwhelmingly and in where he was leading in the polls? So again, what's the social desirability not to report supporting President Trump in a state where President Trump is already leading? So again, those two combinations, the fact that we don't really see any difference in the polling results, whether we're using human interviewers or internet or IVR interviewers, and also the fact that the polling errors were largest in those states where President Trump was already predicted to win that state, suggests that the evidence for the shy Trump voters, at least as far as I can tell, is not really strong and not very clear. So let's wrap this up. So what have we done? So we began by talking about the goals and the tools of survey research. So hopefully now you know I have a couple ideas about not only what survey researchers do, why, and how, but also, perhaps more importantly for being a consumer, what are the type of errors that pollsters can encounter in their work, and how that should make you critical before you accept any results that are told to you. So in particular, we identified 3 types of polling errors: administration-based errors, that's errors in how the survey is done; respondent and societal-based errors, so that's errors in basically how the respondent deals with the survey instrument; and then finally, instrument-based errors, so question wording and question order. So far, we've only talked about the first type of error, administration-based errors, and we talked about 2 types of errors. First, sampling bias, which is that the people that we're talking to in our survey may not reflect the population, so in this case, the set of voters on election day, and that can be consequential for introducing errors into the poll that we make. And we illustrated this by looking at the 1936 Literary Digest poll, by looking at the difference between cell phone and landline users, and how that can impact poll results, and also by looking at IVR robopolls, and the difficulties it poses for pollsters, and also for you as consumers of polls, for trying to think about how to interpret the results from those types of polls. And the second type of administration-based error that we talked about was interviewer effects. And we talked about how the race of the interviewer can affect the results, especially for questions dealing with race and politics. And then we also looked at another example about the shy Trump voter, where despite lots of claims about the prevalence of the shy Trump voter and how that affects polling, that we didn't see a whole lot of evidence for that to be the case. Now we'll dive a little bit deeper even still on that question when we talk about 2016 polling in depth. But for now, looking at the available evidence, it doesn't seem to be a very pervasive explanation. So next time together, we're going to talk about the 2 remaining types of errors: respondent societal-based errors and also instrument-based errors. And as a result of that, hopefully that'll conclude all the different ways of thinking about polling and empower you as a consumer of polls to be able to understand and trust which numbers you should believe and which numbers you shouldn't. And if you don't just say fake polls, but think about exactly why. What are the reasons why you don't think the poll is accurate? And hopefully you should be able to articulate, given the tools and given the concepts we've been talking about in class, that you can think about exactly how the poll could be wrong and what the reason is and how to explain that to someone who may not be a polling expert. So see you next time. Take care.